Welcome to the very first of our new series, if this works, yes. Very first of our new series, Connecting with Our Leaders. Rick Chavez Zbur is here. He represents a large portion of West LA in the California State Assembly. He practiced law, environmental law, and retired in 2014. He's also the chair of the California League of Conservation Voters Board of Directors from 2011 to 2017, and since 2014, he's led the California Equality California, the largest LGBT civil rights organization in California. And in November, he got elected to represent District 51, us, and today he's here to speak with us about civic engagement, his career in politics, and the role of the state assembly and local government. So now I'll hand it on to him to give more about his background and everything, and then we'll go to the interview.
Well, thank you all for being here today and for having me come visit. How many of you have spent any time focusing on the California legislature? A few of you. So basically, just to give you a primer, the California legislature, obviously we have two bodies, the Assembly and the Senate. I represent the 51st District, which runs all the way from Los Feliz, and it goes over the hill, and I've got Universal City and Universal Studios. And then I've got Hancock Park, Larchmont Village, the Hollywood Hills on the LA side, Hollywood, West Hollywood, Beverly Hills, Westwood and UCLA, a lot of West Los Angeles, and then Santa Monica. So it's a district that includes about 660,000 people. I was elected in November, and my goals in office were obviously to address the crisis of housing and homelessness that I think we all see has risen to crisis proportions as one of my key goals, and I've got a number of bills that are focused on that. And then my second set of goals is really addressing the crisis of climate change. You're going to hear the word crisis a lot today because I think we're facing a lot of things that are impacting the world broadly, and your generation in particular, and climate change is something that I've been working on while I was at the California League of Conservation Voters. It's now been renamed California Environmental Voters. And so I've got a number of bills that are actually focused on really addressing climate change by focusing on electrifying our homes and making sure that we've got electric charging stations and that we're actually building housing near transit, and we're doing all the things we need to do to, and my main bill is really one that will try to accelerate the development of offshore wind so that we can get off of dirty fossil fuels power in California. And then the third my third set of priorities is advancing civil rights and social justice. I was really proud to have run Equality California, which is the largest statewide LGBTQ plus civil rights organization in the country. I have a bill that is focused on making sure that all of our schools are safe and supportive for LGBTQ and all kids. One of the things that we know is that LGBTQ people face, when you look at measures of health and well-being, everything from rates of homelessness, where 4 out of 10 homeless youth are members of the LGBTQ community, to rates of poverty, to rates of school dropout, to engagement with the criminal justice system, rates of health coverage. Really almost every measure of health and well-being, the LGBTQ community scores low. And if you're a member of our community who's also a member of a community of color, or you're an immigrant, or you're a person living with HIV, or you're even a woman, you're at the bottom of those measures. And so one of the things that the Safe and Supportive Schools Act, my bill, does is it basically is trying to make sure that school teachers and school staff understand the LGBTQ community and really how to intervene when kids are having trouble. And we know from studies that if you don't come from a family that is actually supportive, that the person that most kids, the person they're most likely to turn to is either a school teacher or someone in the school, as a school counselor, for help. And if those teachers don't actually understand how to assist folks, it means that it's less likely that people are going to get the help they need. So my bill does that. I also have a number of other bills to help create pathways of opportunity to join the teaching profession. As you know, you probably know, we actually have a really big shortage of teachers in the school. I have a bill that basically helps people like cafeteria workers and bus drivers and others who may not have had the opportunity to become a teacher when they got out of high school to basically train and go to school and have the resources they need to actually join the teaching profession from what they're doing today. That gives you a little bit of a range of things. I'll tell you just by way of background, I grew up in a small farm community south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's called Los Lunas. I came from a very, very different kind of high school than you all go to. It was a very, very rural. It's probably 50 miles from one end of my district to another. I was the first person in my rural high school to ever go to an Ivy League college. No one in my family had ever done that before. It was sort of a long story about how I got there, but it involved the fact that I wanted to come out to Pomona College, not thinking that it was like on the water. I didn't realize it was like 2 hours from the water. And so I ended up taking a test. In my high school, we didn't have like college prep stuff. I mean, it just wasn't any way, you didn't take courses to help prepare you for the exams and all of that. So I ended up taking an exam for the military service academies as a practice for the SAT, which was required back then, and scored really high and ended up getting this appointment to West Point, which I knew, I think back in those days, even though I wasn't out yet, I knew that I just knew that was not a good thing for me. And so I ended up, because of that, figuring that I needed to do something that was viewed as equivalent. And I ended up applying out of this really small rural farm town to a bunch of Ivy League schools. And because I was, was such a small school, I think I ended up having a lot of advantages, and actually was very lucky and got in there, and it basically changed my life. And then spent time after that working for a congressman in Iowa on his first re-election campaign. And then when I was done with that, I went back to Harvard Law School. I'm a lawyer now, came out here, spent most of my career practicing environmental law at Latham & Watkins, which is a large law firm in downtown LA. Went from there to run Equality California, which is the LGBTQ civil rights organization, and decided to run for office because my sister, I've always been sort of at the periphery of public policy, because I actually think that government is one of the ways that you can have the most impact on making things better in the world and making the lives of people better. And so I'd always done things when I was at California Environmental Voters. I was always sort of, using the tools of government as an advocate from the outside to try to do more to protect our environment and fight climate change. Then at Equality California, really try to achieve social justice for LGBTQ people and all the communities that we're a part of. And so I'd always done it as an advocate from the outside. And then I had a sister who passed away in 2020, sort of at the beginning of the peak of the COVID crisis, but not from COVID, but she had been diagnosed with ALS, which is a really debilitating neurological disease. And about 9 or 10 months before she passed away, she was already in a wheelchair. I mean, you lose the ability to eat and walk and talk. It's really just this horrible, horrible disease. And she was my best friend, and she turned to me at one point and she said, Rick, I've been thinking about the things that I didn't do in my life, and I have some regrets now, and I know that that's, I'm not going to have that ability to do that. And, even though you're, from your perspective, I was really super old at that point. She said, you still got a lot of opportunity to do things, and I actually always thought you should be doing something in public service. So promise me that you're going to think about doing something in public service. And, it's just sort of a lesson for all of you, I think, that no matter what your age is, whether you're young and or you're sort of in the early part of your adult career or you're in the middle part, it's never too late, I think, to sort of pursue things that I think are fulfilling for you and that have an ability to improve the lives of your community or your family or whatever it is that you really sort of care about. So anyway, so I decided after that discussion with my sister, I decided that I was going to run for office. And the assembly person who used to represent this district, Richard Bloom, decided he was going to run for another seat. So this seat opened up, what they call it, an open seat. And so meaning there wasn't an incumbent in the seat. So I decided to run for it. And was very privileged that the people of the 51st District decided to elect me, and I've sort of been in office now since November, and working on that whole package of laws and bills. So let me, I don't know, is it appropriate now to sort of do the interview? Is that enough time? So anyway, I just want to thank you all for having me here, and just appreciate your interest in government, and the things that we can do to try to help protect our community. I mean, when people ask me, like, do you really like this new job? And my response is, I don't think I could have a better job, because, how often do you get a job where your whole job is getting up every morning and figuring out what you can do to sort of make things better for people? I mean, that's really what this job is about. So I'm trying to get out everywhere to make sure that I'm listening to people in my district. I understand what the problems are, and that I'm doing my best to basically, through our state government, make things better. So anyway, thank you for having me here.
So you already answered a bunch of our questions, which is great. But you talked about your sister's passing, and also how you were involved civically. But were those the main key factors that influenced your decision to want to run for public office?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've always been someone that, so my dad, frankly, is one of my heroes. I mean, a lot of people I have a bunch of heroes, but he's one of them. He's someone who dropped out of high school when he was 16 years old, because he was from a really poor family in the south side of Chicago, and he actually had to drop out to help support his family. And so when he was someone who was like really patriotic, and so he enlisted in the Air Force during the Korean conflict. And because of the fact that there's this program called the GI Bill that actually provided him the opportunity, paid for him to go to college. He couldn't afford it, frankly, coming from this really poor family. He basically, after he served in the military when he was in his late 20s, went back to high school to get his high school diploma, and then went on and got a college degree, and ultimately got a graduate degree and got a PhD and became a college professor. And he was someone who was always very politically active, and he was just someone who just didn't, like, if he didn't think something was right, he just, he was sort of the example for me. It's sort of like, okay, if you don't think something is right, try to spend your time to do something about it. And my dad was always that example, and he, at a very small level, was very active politically, trying to we had a lot of elected officials in this little county where I lived in that were really pretty corrupt, and my dad just, didn't like that. And so he was active trying to get, the supervisors changed, and, was really politically active, and I was sort of his sidekick. And so I would do these things politically with him. So that was like, that was always part of my upbringing. And then, as I got older, I started having, being concerned about things that were happening in the world. And so the natural way for me to sort of have an impact was really to advocate to government. So that's why I got involved with California Environmental Voters, and became active advocating for environmental progress. My sort of re-emergence in politics after I got out of law school had to do a little bit with the AIDS crisis, because I'm of that generation where a big chunk of people my age just didn't survive. I mean, the early years of the AIDS crisis, there were not treatments, there was not medical care, and you had a large percentage of people that were passing away, and we had a federal government that wasn't doing anything about it. So I became very active, really advocating and trying to elect people that were going to actually pay attention to the AIDS crisis. And that's when I became politically engaged, and then sort of turned that over to sort of the environmental space, and working with Equality California after that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I feel like it's a common thing for politicians to first just get involved in politics because of advocacy and the issues they care about, and also their upbringing. So yeah, it's really amazing. So now on to your election. So last November you won by a really large margin, 10 points around, was it? So what do you think made your campaign successful over your opponents?
So first of all, I had a great opponent. I just want to say that I think it was really just talking about in a way that was really honest about the things that I wanted to do in office. And
That seems to work for a lot of people.
It does. And then also I think just people, I think understanding, I've been really active with progressive organizations in a bunch of different places. So, obviously California Environmental Voter, so I know the environmental organizations that do advocacy there, Equality California, which is active in the LGBTQ space, but we're a civil rights organization, so we dealt with all the civil rights groups as partners to advance civil rights for all communities that are facing lack of acceptance. And then I also serve on the board of directors for Planned Parenthood Los Angeles on reproductive rights. So when you look at it, I think people looked at sort of the environment that we're in today with so many threats to personal freedom coming about as part of the dialogue. And and I sort of see this a lot, the rise of anti-Semitism in our communities, especially, even here in Beverly Hills. And I think people looked at me and they realized, okay, he's got a lot of experience in a lot of the areas that we're having to grapple with now, and that are at the forefront of the decisions that we're making in government. And so I personally, think that people looked at my background, and I'm someone who believes that experience does matter when you're talking about electing officials. I mean, lots of things matter, right? You can actually have someone who's young and inspirational and just really skilled to do a good job, but there's also a role for understanding how the legislative process works and actually understanding sort of what the lessons are where you failed before, to move things ahead. So I think it was a combination of those things.
That makes sense. So you already talked about a lot of the major issues that you care about, but what specifically do you want to work around in your term?
So the three key things: climate change for me, addressing housing and homelessness, and then obviously advancing civil rights and social justice. So those will be, I've got the bills that we've talked about this year, but I'm looking at sort of, how we sort of continue making progress year to year. Climate change, I got to say, we are so far behind where we need to be.
Yeah, that's a really big issue too.
It's a huge, huge issue. And so, I've got the three bills, the offshore wind bill. I've got another one that requires every local jurisdiction to put in place a climate action electrification plan. So to start thinking about, okay, where are we going to put electric chargers in every community? Obviously, if you live in a home, right, and you're relatively affluent, you pay for your own charger and you put it in your driveway or in your garage. But if you're someone that's coming from a low-income household, you may not live someplace where you even have assigned parking spot in your apartment, or you may park on the street. By 2035, we've made a decision here in California that we are going to move to only sell electric vehicles in the state of California. Oh, wow. So we actually have to have a charging infrastructure in place so that everyone can charge their cars at night. And we're not doing the planning that we need to get there. So one of my bills will require the city of Beverly Hills and every other city and county to basically look at how to develop strategies on how we're going to put the electric charging infrastructure in place, how we're going to actually electrify our homes. It will require that they'll put in identify charging corridors where people can actually charge overnight, like by plugging into a parking meter, those kind of things. So I see you have a question over here.
Yeah, sorry. So I've heard many times in the news that California wants to electrify vehicles by 2035. But how does the state government plan to enforce that? Is that something they can enforce, or is it more of like an encouragement?
No, it's a mandate, but it won't outlaw non-electric vehicles by 2035. But new cars that are sold in 2035, you will only be able to buy an electric car in the state of California. So obviously, at 2035 afterwards, there will still be gas-powered vehicles on the road, but those will age and eventually they'll go away. So by 2035, a hybrid vehicle would not be sold new. There will still be hybrid vehicles on the road that are sold before 2035 until they age out and no longer run, right? But by 2035, all new vehicles and passenger vehicles in the state would have to be electric. Hi.
So you're talking about electrifying homes and electrifying cars and all these power stations, but currently we're experiencing brownouts and blackouts all over the state of California. So what are you guys doing in order to prep the power grid in order to handle all this new power draw, and where would all this new power draw come from? Because it just comes from coal plants or stuff. That's not really like that.
Yeah, I mean that's a really smart question because one of the things so there's sort of two sides of the climate issue, right? One side is how do we reduce all of the carbon emissions that we have that are causing our world to warm, and so some of that is by electrifying things that are now powered through combustion sources which cause carbon, right? So that means electrifying all of our cars, moving our natural gas, our water heaters to electric, making sure that everything that's a combustion source is actually something that becomes electric or some other renewable energy that's no carbon. And there's some other alternatives to electricity, but the main thrust is electricity. So you have that side on that side. Then you raise the question, which you're raising, which is, well, how are you going to electrify all of that? It means you're going to need a lot more electricity, right? So the reality is we're going to need about 2.5 times the amount of electricity available on the grid, right, in the state of California that we have now. So some of doing that is actually creating new sources of power and, apropos of your question, really improving the transmission grid to make sure we can get all that power to the places that we need it. Even if you're not building like a new community that requires new power lines out to, someplace near Camarillo where you've got a new subdivision out in that area. Just the homes that are here in Beverly Hills will need twice as much power, and so we do have those issues of, does our transmission structures, they're going to accommodate all of that? Do we have to upgrade it? Generally, we do have improvements in technology, so you don't need to add all new power lines. There's more efficient energy conductors. There are things you can do to improve the transmission, but we do have to improve our transmission infrastructure to get there. And that's what a lot of these agencies are doing. Some of the bills I have are actually are focused on the one for the city of Beverly Hills. It's basically, okay, plan ahead what we need to do, because we need planning to take place so that we can actually make sure that we're upgrading our transmission infrastructure to prevent brownouts and protect all of that. And then the other part of it is, okay, so where is this new electricity going to come from? We're going to need about a little more than double the amount of electricity that we have now. A lot of it will come from solar power, but so the sun doesn't shine all the time, right? And electricity is not something that, if it's on the transmission grid, if you don't use it, it doesn't go to some place that it's used. It just, it evaporates, right? Unless it goes into a battery, right? So the combination is that we need to actually have wind power, which actually it powers in the evening times, and we need to actually have more battery technology. So I mean, the world that you all will be living in the future is going to be, you all likely will have batteries in your garage or in someplace in the apartment building to be storing power for the evening hours. That is part of the future that we have. And then also we're going to need wind coming in from both onshore and offshore. We've got and that's one of the key things that I'm really worried about. It's like we're really behind getting that wind online, and we've got to do more to accelerate getting that in place. And so my big bill, AB3, the California Offshore Wind and Jobs Act, is something that's intended to try to get offshore wind, to accelerate it, get it moving. The other good thing for all of you is that one of the really great things about moving to a clean energy economy is that it actually provides a lot of economic advantages for us. I mean, if we are going to be the state that is moving the fastest of any place in the country. Unfortunately, not every place in the world. I mean, there are places in Europe that are ahead of us on on the conversion to clean energy.
We should follow their lead.
we should follow their lead. But the really cool thing is, this is going to create tens and tens and tens of thousands of high-skilled, high-wage jobs here in California. I think it's going to be, I don't know if you've read yet about sort of what happened in California during right before World War II, we developed a huge aerospace industry here in Southern California that was actually due to the spending that we actually had to do to defend the country during World War II. But it led to Southern California being a center of aerospace manufacturing that really sort of fed this economy for a period of time. I actually think that offshore wind is really provides that opportunity to provide jobs for you and your families and kids across the state. And the really cool thing about it is that it's something that we can also make sure we're meeting environmental justice goals, and we're making sure that like all communities are being uplifted, and that we can have manufacturing facilities in places across the state. I mean, these wind turbines. How many of you have driven out to Palm Springs and have seen those sort of wind turbines on the way out? Those wind turbines are teeny compared to the ones that are going to be offshore, like teeny. The wind turbine that you've seen in Palm Springs, which are like 3 arms, one of those wind turbines that is going to be out on the ocean will, the arms of the turbine will not fit in Dodger Stadium. That's how big these wind turbines are.
Wow.
So they'll be 3 miles out, so you can't really see them, but they're these huge wind turbines. And so we've got to expand our ports so that we can actually assemble these massive turbines and then haul them out 3 miles out, and then they will be floating, but then sort of affixed to the water. So it's, just think about like the manufacturing of all of these, the assembling of all these, the maintenance of all these. These are thousands and thousands of really highly technical and really good jobs.
So you talked about the long-term benefits of renewable energy, but in the short term, how are you guys planning on funding, the solar power, the wind power? Is it more raising taxes or redirecting funds from a different sector?
So one of the really good things that happened is that there's a lot of funds that have been made available by the federal government in the various packages of bills that were recently passed by Congress and signed into law by President Biden.
The infrastructure bill?
The infrastructure bill, and both the infrastructure bill and the other one that was done before that. And so there's tax credits, there's funding for infrastructure. It's not going to be enough. Last year, the state budget, I think, included something like almost $60 billion in funding for our conversion to a clean energy economy and climate-related expenditures. So there's funding for a lot of these things. There was in last year's budget. Excuse me. This year's budget, we're actually facing a bit of a budget deficit compared to last year. So there probably will not be as much in this year's budget that's going to climate, but I'm fighting for there to be for there to be funding to continue funding all these things in the state budget for climate. And there's a lot of talk about a climate bond that will be going on the ballot to provide, and it's unclear what, but it'll be in the billions of dollars, but to provide more funding to fund all of these things. We are going to need, if you think about it, just moving all of our homes from natural gas to electricity. It's not just the cost of like buying an electric stove or an electric water heater. I mean, one of the things we need to do is we need to convert all of these homes from electricity, which means that every house has to have an electrician coming in and a plumber to basically change all these things so you can install these things. And, I can afford to pay for that, but like in California, where something like 35% of people are living near the poverty line, folks can't afford that. So without subsidies and subsidy programs in place, we're not going to be able to do all the things that we need to do to electrify our homes and our transportation infrastructure. And frankly, the charging for cars. One of the things we do know is if you can afford an electric vehicle, right, the fuel costs are way less than driving a gas vehicle now. So we need to make it possible for everyone to be able to afford an electric vehicle, and we need to make sure that the charging infrastructure is there. I mean, I know when we had these gas spikes, right, over the course of the last year, and all my friends who were driving gas-powered vehicles were facing these humongous increases in their gas bills, their gas for the car bills every month. I was like, I'm not facing any of that because I drive an electric vehicle, and my costs have not gone up at all. And when I started comparing, I was realizing that my operating costs for my car are probably half of what they are. Maybe it might even be a third of what they are for a gas-powered vehicle. So we're getting to the point where the economics, it used to be that, the electric vehicle was always more expensive and people were doing it based upon what they thought was right and trying to make sure that we were, doing what's right for the planet. But now it's getting to the point where the operating costs are actually less than they are for gas vehicles. And so we need to make sure that all the barriers for people that are lower income and disadvantages, that we're actually addressing those so that everyone can actually have the advantages of moving to electric vehicles.
Yeah, and it must be easier, making improvements on this, really big issues like climate change when, in California we have majority Democrats, and so it's easier to get things passed than it is in Congress, right? Mm-hmm. So speaking about the state assembly, a lot of people don't know what you guys, do or what you guys are. When I try to explain it, I compare it to the House of Representatives, mm-hmm. but on a state level. So would you agree with that comparison, or what exactly would you describe to be the state assembly?
It's exactly that. I mean, it's sort of the legislative branch of, California government parallels the federal government. We have three branches of government: the judiciary, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. And so the state assembly is one of the houses of the legislative branch of government. It's comparable to Congress, to the House of Representatives at the federal level. And we actually have a state Senate. And so my role is, I have basically two basic roles. One is to, most of what I do needs to be advancing what they call a legislative function, which is basically looking at adopting new laws to try to address problems that people of the state of California face, or advance interests for the people and to improve the lives of people in the state of California. Or serve my constituents in problems they're having with government at all levels. So I've got Hannah and Sherwin, who are two of my field reps, are here with me today. They spend all of their time in my office here in the district, and they take calls helping people who are having problems with with EDD or getting their driver's licenses, or whatever their problems are with state government and even local government, connecting them to the right resources in local government and in federal government, frankly. So it's either helping those or actually passing laws. And so every day I go into office, I'm actually trying to get my laws passed. So I'm doing all the things that I need to do. There's people that oppose some of what I do, and when that happens, I try to see if there's things that I can do to change the bill to address their concerns. The legislative process is sort of iterative, right? And the goal is really to make things better without hurting anyone. And so if there's ways you can actually change your loan law that you're proposing so that you're not hurting someone and at the same time making things better for people, that's the goal. So I spend a lot of time in meetings, even on my own bills, trying to get them through, trying to build support, trying to convince my colleagues who are in the Assembly and the State Senate to vote for my bills when they go through committees. There's a bunch of committees in the legislature on a whole bunch of subject areas. I serve on public safety. I serve on tax and rev. I served on rules, which sort of runs the Assembly. I serve on natural resources, which most of the environmental bills go through, and I serve on environmental safety and toxics, which is a lot of the bills related to food safety and consumer products, all of that. And so I have my own bills there, and then I have to vote on bills that come through. I think this year there were 2,700 bills that were introduced by members of the legislature. And so every one of those bills that comes to my committee, I've got to actually understand it well enough so that I can actually vote for it or against it. And then ultimately, some portion of those bills, of the 2,700, will get out of committees and actually make it to the floor of the legislature. And I would guess it's probably about half of those bills. Then I have to make a decision on probably 1,000 to 1,300 additional bills. So that's what I'm doing every day. Like this weekend, I will be preparing and looking at all the bills that are going to be coming to the Assembly floor on Monday morning or on Monday afternoon. We have a session from starting at 1 o'clock until it ends. On
You
Monday
don't get a
afternoon.
break, do you?
You don't really get a break. I try to take half a day off on Sundays, but
So our last question, so that we have time for the Q&A. What would you? A lot of people in the room aren't 18 yet. So what would you recommend they do if they want to get engaged civically, even though they can't vote?
get involved with an organization that's actually doing work in the area that you're interested in. There's all kinds of organizations, and if you actually, have an area, we can provide suggestions. There's all kinds of organizations that are that focus on public policy or advocacy work that always need help. And so I would sort of say get involved with one of those organizations. That kind of involvement. I think looking for internships in the summer. I think that's something that's something that you might want to do, and then just learning about issues and just becoming politically engaged and active. I think on the gun safety issue, it's people in your generation that I think have really been responsible for really getting what little movement has happened. It's been responsible for sort of re-energizing that movement. And I am still hopeful that we can we've done a lot here in California. I mean, in California, we actually have, as unsafe as we may feel at times, and we actually have very strong gun safety laws here in California. The problem is that the states around us don't. So we don't, there's a lot of laws that are a lot of guns that are sort of purchased in Nevada and Arizona and brought into the state. And so, but I think that, that's an example of, I think, where folks in your generation are really, and I actually think that we're going to turn the corner on this, I think, at some point.
Hopefully.
We need federal action.
Yeah. Now I'm going to turn it over to Justin Greenberg. He's going to be doing the Q&A portion.
Oh, good.
Hello, thank you all for being here, of course, and thank you, Mr. Zbur.
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So we did set up a Google form for people to submit questions that they wanted to ask. And our first question is, what is the difference between the roles and responsibilities of the state assembly versus the state senate?
So they're not all that much different. They pretty much do the same thing. It's just that the state senate, the term of office is longer, and so in theory, the state senate is less responsive to sort of short-term political pressure than the state assembly. Like, I have to get elected every 2 years, right? The state senators actually have 4. So there's fewer of them. There's about half as many state senators as there are members of the assembly, but they also are part of the legislature. Every bill that I submit will actually have to be approved by both the assembly and the state senate. And then if they're approved on both houses, they'll go to the governor for signature. So they're pretty much doing the same thing, but it's a smaller body. It's viewed as, the theory is that one is more deliberative, and the assembly is somehow closer to the people because we're elected more often. But I don't see them being all that different. But they do represent more people. They're bigger. The districts are bigger.
Okay, that's a great answer. And our second question is, what types of bills and laws does the state legislature have power over compared to the federal government?
Pretty much everything. There's no area that we don't have power over unless it's an area that is preempted by federal law, and there are some areas that are. So, the federal government, for example, preempts state action in a lot of areas of communication, and there is some amount of, there are limitations on what we can do when the federal government has already acted and when they've passed a law that says states, you are limited in what you can do. Okay. But you remember under the Constitution, right? It's sort of the Constitution of the United States, right? Basically, all laws that the federal government, all powers that the federal government doesn't expressly assume, are reserved to the states. So, in pretty much every area, we have some ability to improve things. And then, frankly, when you look at the problems that we face in our communities here in the state of California, one of the things I think is exciting about the role that I have is that we don't have the same kind of inertia, we don't have the same kind of impediments that you do at the federal and at Congress in sort of making changes. I mean, we pass bills and get them signed into laws every year, whereas, you've got this stalemate that's happening in Washington in many cases.
All right, and then we'll just end it off with one more question. Overall, what is the best part of being an Assembly member?
I think the best part of being an Assembly member is the fact that I have the ability to make change in any area that I think is important that improves people's lives. I mean, I really do think that the best thing about this job is that I've got a job where, the people are paying me to try to make things better. So, it's sort of like, I don't know that I can't necessarily make things better in every place, because I've got to, some things cost money, and I've got to convince the governor and a lot of people to spend more money on things. Other things there's a lot of disagreement about what we should do. But if there's something that I think is really important, I can actually spend my time trying to make change in that area. And so, like, for example, for me, like the fact that I've got the major bill that's moving offshore wind ahead. I'm a freshman legislator. Every environmental group, every labor union, every wind developer, all the ports, all of them are supporting my bill. I have no opposition to it because I've worked really hard to basically put together a bill that really moves us ahead. That's something that I've only been in office for like 4 months, and I think I have an ability to hopefully have a big impact on making sure that we can actually meet our climate objectives. The Safe and Supportive Schools bill, right? I mean, I know how important it is that we actually make sure that our schools are serving all of our kids, and how important it is that we actually have that our teachers be trained. And I know it even from my own daughter. When she was in middle school, she walked into her classroom one day and opened up the textbook to the book that they were in, and there was a derogatory. Obviously, she has LGBTQ plus parents. Written in Sharpie across the pages was "kill all the," and then there were expletives there. And she turned it over. She, showed her teacher that day, and the teacher was, I think, distracted. And so she called me that night. She was really upset, and she said, "What do you think I should do, Dad?" And I said, "Well, the teacher may have been distracted on what he was doing that day." I said, "You should probably take him aside when he's not in the middle of teaching the class." And so she sent him an email that night and said, "I don't know if you saw what happened, but this was in my book, and this is obviously hate speech, and I think that something should have been done about it." And he said, "Come into class." This is by email. Said, "Come into class the next day." And so she did, and he opened up the door, and he opened up his desk drawer, and he took out whiteout, and he said, "Just white it out. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Well, obviously that's not the right response. He was not a homophobic teacher. He wasn't. He was a really good teacher, but it's just like he did not have the training. And if you don't, to know really how to handle that situation. And obviously there's a way to handle that that's right, which is like using it as a teaching moment, making sure that, that there's some, that there's an expression of support of the kid who's facing that, and that you're, dealing with that in an appropriate way. But, everyone needs to have training on those kinds of things. So, that's a bill that I'm doing that I'm really proud of. I mean, it will have a really big impact on, and hopefully an impact on your school before you all are out. I don't know how many of you are seniors and how many are younger, but, this will go into effect by, I think, 2025. So, yeah.
And that's truly incredible, because your work really is making a difference in not only our lives, but the lives of everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for
Thank you for having me.